Hey, Jake Williams from Edition InfoSec here. I wanted to chat a little bit about a supply chain compromise. Now, if you're following the news today, The Intercept just released a very interesting article, which I'll link to, of course, in both the blog post as well as the video comments, about supply chain interdiction being done by government sources. Right here, they heavily rely on the leaked Snowden documents, and they mention that, of course, the U.S. of course may have been involved in this. They also reference France and Germany, and the potential, of course, for both China and Russia to have the resources to do this. Now, this is particularly interesting because, of course, the earlier Bloomberg story, that referenced the possibility that there were specific chips being put on the SM bus, presumably the SM bus, of these Supermicro servers. Right, so I wanted to kind of talk about supply chain in general, but there's an actual software supply chain attack that's been observed in the wild. Now, if I sound excited about this, supply chain is kind of a thing of mine, at least a passion of mine. It's something I've been consulting with clients on. It's something that they should have in their threat model for years, right? So this is not new to us. It's something that we've been thinking about quite a bit. And so, definitely something that we're looking into, and something that we keep an open eye for. We've also had the opportunity to do a number of vulnerability assessments for clients where they've outsourced software development for internal software applications, where we have found issues, whether those are out of date and known vulnerable libraries that were linked into the software, all the way up to and including, of course, what we would term as a bug door, right? So a backdoor that is itself so weirdly positioned or so oddly coded, it's a bug that could be used as a backdoor, right? So again, very difficult to determine intent there, but there are some that are so flagrant that you almost have to go, it didn't happen by accident, right? If it happened intentionally, then indeed that bug is not just a bug, but a backdoor itself. So all kinds of right across the spectrum there, but an actual software supply chain vulnerability, it involves the PEAR PHP package manager. Right? So if you're familiar with PHP, if you're not familiar with PHP, you should know that some modules are included via what's something called a PEAR repository, and basically the PEAR loader that originally installs the binaries for PEAR was ultimately compromised, and it was compromised some time ago. Right, so this is not something that was just discovered this week, but was compromised at least 6 months ago. Forensic investigations, of course, are ongoing. Very interestingly, just simply created a backdoor shell off to a server, and that server specifically is believed to be another compromised host. So it's unlikely then they're going to have to do some forensics. And this is such a great, interesting point here. In order to really determine who did this, who perpetuated this attack, it appears we not only have to do forensics, of course, and the reverse engineering on this backdoor in the PEAR application itself. We also then have to come back and take a look at the server that ultimately was establishing the command and control channels. Right now, there's a lot of unanswered questions at this point, but it's believed that if you installed PEAR within the last 6 months, that you definitely need to consider yourself compromised, or know that the attackers had the access to compromise your systems. Here's what we don't know, and this, of course, is very interesting as well, and it's going to take some time, of course, to flush out. Some of the stuff that we don't know that's really interesting here in the PEAR piece is how did the attackers gain access to compromise the software in the PEAR repository in the first place? Now, the folks who run PEAR, are the organization that runs PEAR is conducting a full forensic examination to try to determine how the attackers gained that access. But let's talk about this for a minute, right? Because what does full forensic investigation mean, right? Well, it means that we're going to have to go into logs, right? And now I've got to ask, what's our log retention look like? Because I don't think that the PEAR maintainers, right, again, we're talking about some of this free and open source, right? So I don't think that the PEAR maintainers I highly doubt that they're dealing with some some high-speed commercial security information event management or SIEM system. I doubt that they have a very long history of logs. I hope I'm wrong. I do hope to be wrong here. But even assuming that that logging was properly configured and you were logging everything that you would have needed to have identified the compromise, we still have the question of, do you have those logs going that far back, right? Again, we know that, again, we're looking at 6 months here, and I'll tell you that a lot of commercial clients, unless they're in some kind of regulated industry that requires them to retain logs longer than 6 months, many of them do not, right? So looking at a free and open source project, assuming that they have that in place is I don't want to say a pipe dream, but I think we're looking at a pretty hard thing to to determine the initial source of compromise. Now, another way that, of course, we could attack this investigation. Oh, by the way, let me step back here too and say that it's very likely in this particular scenario, given that we're talking about code contributions, I would certainly I would certainly bet some lunch money on it that it's likely that the original source, right, is going to end up being some compromised developer machine, some compromised developer or contributor or package maintainer endpoint machine, where the attacker is now pivoting through that machine. And again, I want to totally say here, right at the moment at least, I'm discounting the idea of insider access. Meaning one of the developers or maintainers themselves went rogue and decided to poison, basically poison the package. Assuming that that's not the case, what we're looking at then, of course, is the possibility that, or the likelihood, again, that attack vector came through one of those endpoints. Now, again, maybe I'm wrong. Could be, right? I'm just playing the odds here based on our incident response experience and what we would expect to see in a scenario like this. So now I've got not just the logs there. We're going to say, yep, came from one of those machines. Okay, well, how did the attackers compromise that machine? Right. Well, now, okay, now if we're talking about an endpoint and we're talking about going back 6+ months of logs, good luck with that. That ain't happening, right? The odds of that happening are ridiculously low. So another possible way that we can investigate this case would be to take a look at the server, likely again a compromised web host, where all of the connections were being funneled back to. And by the way, the backdoor itself is exceedingly crude. It opens up bin bash, binds standard in, standard out, and standard error to bin bash, and does that with some fwrite calls there, or well, the bind actually, but then does the legit fread and fwrite calls basically on that bound input, right? So we're talking like backdoor 101, right? Super low tech, super low tech reverse shell, but it works. And I guess that's probably the most important point, is that it works, right? Okay, so then what, right? Well, again, several other questions here. Suppose that we go over to that other server, this compromised web host or presumed compromised web host, begin doing investigations there, right? Again, it's same deal here. We need to take a look at who's accessing those shells. Are they accessing those reverse shells? Or those reverse shells simply call out and nothing happened? Of course, this seems like a fairly complex attack to get into, supply chain distribution in such a prolific piece of software and not be detected for 6 months. It seems like such a long tail kind of approach, or long game kind of approach, that it would seem unlikely to me that they wouldn't be interacting with those, right? And of course, we could kick out an ACH, analysis of competing hypotheses matrix, to go take a look at the probabilities here, but I think they probably are interacting with it. But I want to be very cautious to say that those who are interacting with the backdoor are not necessarily the same ones, not necessarily the same group or entity, and may not even be more than tertiarily or have some fleeting relationship to the group that created the backdoor in the first place. Right? It's entirely plausible that some group had the access to put this backdoor in place and then simply shopped that access around. Now we have to ask ourselves, what are the odds of that, right? Well, here's what we do know, right? Doing some searches through some of our dark web forum posts, nothing that I have access to mentions any sale, and I look back kind of in that target region, time frame there, region of time there, about somebody advertising that type of access, right? So if indeed that's the case, where they are separated, right? Then in different groups, right? One group has access to create the backdoor, another group's like, yep, we're down for that. Let's do it, right? If that's the case, again, I don't have any evidence to support that, and I would expect that if this were something that was a broad sale, right, a broadly advertised sale, they of course, for obvious reasons, are not going to say PEAR, right? We can get into the PEAR repository and you get a backdoor in there and the whole. But again, I'm trying to think about like supply chain or software, software deployment, library support. Again, I don't see anything being advertised around that time with access, access to that. Now, of course, again, could be some search terms that I'm not aware of being used to advertise that, or something I didn't think of being used to advertise that. Alternatively, of course, it may be it was publicly advertised in a form that I simply don't have access to. I've got access through a number of vendors to a number of forms that are being mined, so I kind of think this is low probability, but is something that that's possible. So I put a moderate confidence assessment that this access wasn't simply being broadly shopped around. Now that doesn't eliminate the possibility that through private messages, that it was shopped to specific, right? So rather than me advertising and saying, as a criminal saying, I've got access to this PEAR repository, does anybody want this backdoor, right? They could have simply sent direct messages and saying, hey, you look like the kind of guy who'd be interested in getting a backdoor over here in a very popular software library management program, right? So that's a possibility as well. Of course, I don't have any evidence to support or refute that, but just want to throw that out there. Bottom line, what we have to be careful about, right, even though there's no evidence that this is the case, we have to be careful to understand that the people operating the backdoor, if that forensic investigation has been conducted or is currently being conducted on that Linux web host, we do know that PEAR's own servers are undergoing a forensic examination. Again, I'm not certain about the Linux server, or presumably Linux server that it's beaconing back to. So again, we don't know who's interacting with that, and even if we did, we would still want to be careful to not conclusively connect them to the basically to that original host, right? Original group there, right? So again, lots of unknowns here, and I would say probably one of the big unknowns here is that if indeed you were compromised, did you, or if indeed you were compromised by that, basically by that PEAR installation, then then again, what follow-on actions were taken? And at this time, I haven't talked to any victims specifically. Obviously, we've reached out to our clients that we know are running this, the folks that we do direct vulnerability management for, we have software inventories for, and we know who is and is not running PEAR, or at least for the systems that we inventory. And so we've reached out to a couple of clients that we know are running PEAR and said, hey, when specifically is this installed? Did you do an upgrade here where you could have potentially brought this code down? Now, again, we don't know the follow-on actions yet, but if you are one of those people, not necessarily yet a rendition client who has updated PEAR, if you want a safety check of your Linux server, or if you want us to do some incident response, we certainly would be very, very interested in that. Also to understand the TTPs, not just to get you clean, but also understand what was the attacker doing on the back end, right? And what does that look like? Right. Certainly, there's some theories kicking around with that. I'm not aware that anybody's published, follow-on actions for these attackers. Right. So for the meantime, the PEAR website is down while they work to. There is a clean version of the installer now that's available, but just a very, very interesting piece here when it comes to supply chain. You may remember, for those that follow us pretty closely, you may remember that at the Threat Hunting Summit in New Orleans last year, released a supply chain threat hunting framework, SCREATH, S-C-R-E-A-T-H. Again, we'll link to that in the video comments and or the blog post. But that was kind of a checklist for things you can think about from a supply chain standpoint, right? So again, picture here, this week we have the disclosure about PEAR, right? So this is discovered. Again, don't know how the attacker compromised the site originally or compromised the software distribution initially. Don't know how, ultimately what they did from a follow-on perspective. We don't know, again, the method by which, basically the method by which the attacker is connected to the server that the malicious software is beaconing to. There's a lot of unknowns at this point, right? But it does remind me a lot of thinking about, for instance, CCleaner, right, which we saw compromised last year, and then of course very, very timely release today by The Intercept, where they discussed some intelligence services supply chain interdiction operations as well, right? So kind of thinking about all that together, I would mention that some takeaways, some things that I would want to think about in a very generic sense from supply chain security would involve things like, obviously download software only from reputable sources. Well, here that completely falls on its face, right? Because of course the PEAR website, the official repository, the installer for PEAR itself was compromised, right? So again, this original cybersecurity 101, right? Don't go download it from some peer-to-peer file sharing network or some random Joe's website. Kind of falls out the window there, right? Now it's worth noting that reverse shell connection was being made on TCP port 443. So even if you had some outbound filtering in place, odds are good that 443 is allowed outbound. With an application layer firewall, right, something that's actually doing layer 7 introspection, you would see obviously that this is not normal connection. Possibly, with intrusion detection systems, that could be another thing that you might see some shell commands kicking around back and forth on. Realistically here, I think one of the big things that we want to look at is logging, right? We've got an outbound connection coming out from this system, with a follow-up of why do I have an outbound connection coming from the system? And I think that's probably one of the more salient points is how important it is to perform good host and network monitoring, right? Well, now I've got a secondary problem because a lot of these web servers, right, the very place that I would expect to install PEAR, very often are deployed in cloud environments, right? So DigitalOcean, Azure, EC2, etc. And many of those don't have all of the same network monitoring controls in place. Many people deploy those in environments or in configurations that don't put those good network security controls in place, right? So yet another potential issue there from a detection standpoint. Look, how do you know if you've been compromised? Well, the reality here is that you should, first off, if you install PEAR in the last 6 months, you should just go ahead and call that a day and start a forensic examination. If you need assistance for that, of course, feel free to contact us. We should do some forensic examination. Separately, I think it's probably worth taking a look at your web root overall. If you've got a good baseline for deployment and you can pull that, basically take a look at have any files been modified in any way, because it may not simply be enough to come back in then and say, okay, well, let me nuke let me go ahead and nuke this PEAR installation and reinstall and go. If attackers have made changes to some of the files in your web root, then again there could be a persistent backdoor there as well, right? So these become some very interesting and very challenging cases to investigate. We've investigated several of these web server compromises where the attacker compromises the web server, and then this is not discovered for 6 months, 8 months, a year, or whatever the case is. And these are extraordinarily difficult to work, particularly when an outsourced developer has been used to develop the source, and we don't have a good source repository. What we have then effectively is basically in many cases a developer was paid to go and deploy that code onto the server, and now we have to set through and say, okay, well, how do we know what good even looks like here, right? Well, if you don't have good baselines, obviously that becomes very, very difficult. This is another great use case or great cautionary tale for the reason that we want those baselines, right? So I guess maybe this is a good spot to kind of wrap it up a little bit, right? I mean, I know I can keep talking about supply chain and PEAR and incident response and all this stuff for quite some time, but I do think it's important to probably my two big takeaways here beyond the obvious, right? If you're compromised, right, then if you deploy PEAR in the last 6 months, then you should assume compromise. Separate from that, though, I think probably my two big takeaways are network and host monitoring. That's such a big one, and to make sure that extends into the cloud, right? The cloud. I know there's the old joke running around about how the cloud is just somebody else's computer, and certainly that's no different here, right? So that's a big one here. Make sure that your architecture and monitoring architecture is identical, or at least feature parity, both on-prem and in the cloud. And if you are going for less monitoring in the cloud, which is typically the case, right? Because again, at this point, we're kind of extending our network boundary, or if you want to argue, a little bit there, maybe we're eliminating that network boundary specifically, but we no longer have that nice, firewalled environment where it's nice, hard, crunchy on the outside and soft, gooey on the inside. So want to think about that a little bit for network and host monitoring. I think the other thing there, of course, is the need for baselines, right? Because I'm going to hazard a guess here, and history I think is going to tell me that I'm right on this. We'll see, of course, but I'll bet that the majority of these, compromised hosts are probably Linux servers in relatively unmanaged environments, right? So personal web hosts, small medium business web hosts, etc. that don't have a dedicated DevOps style team. That they don't have that whole test, deployment, prod environment, set of environments there, and so my guess is here that that it's very likely we don't have good baselines. So I would take this away as a secondary point in addition to the endpoint and network monitoring, and think about what can you do today to create a good baseline. So if you get hit tomorrow with something like this, it's not going to be a big deal, right? So anyway, let's go ahead and close this out here. Jake Williams from Edition InfoSec, signing off.